Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to day 155 of Humanity Rising. Humanity Rising is an initiative of Ubiquity University and well over 350 partnering organizations that have come together in the midst of this extraordinary pandemic to provide a daily open space so that people literally globally can come together to share their experiences, their concerns, their solutions, their aspirations, visions, and strategic counsel as to how we can increase our effectiveness in order to shape the world beyond the pandemic in a way that's more sustainable and abundant, resilient, regenerative, healthy, and in alignment with natural systems. This is our final week before we take a break for the holidays on Friday. And we want to take up today one of the central challenges confronting humanity worldwide. And that is the challenge of shape-shifting the global corporations at a time when the corporations are devastating the planet and community for the sake of profit, and have been doing so egregiously that scientists are telling us we're literally running out of time to change our momentum, or else we may well lose the world as we know it. What I would like to just point out, just as we begin today, is that the corporation, the primacy of the corporation is a relatively new phenomenon. You know, if you went back 1,000 years from today, there weren't any global corporations. The church held primacy in Europe and most places around the world. And then with the rise of the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, political institutions, nation states began to consolidate supreme power. Scientists, in the aftermath of the Enlightenment, became, in effect, the new priesthood. And it wasn't until really the 20th century, the late 19th, early 20th century, that the corporations began to supplant the nation states as focal points of supreme power. And now, literally worldwide, the corporate sector is in command of the multinational institutions, national institutions of all kinds. And we are in that moment where the primacy of the corporation is being challenged both internally and externally. It may be worth just pointing out that the oldest continuously operating corporation comes out of Osaka, Japan. The Kongo Gumi Construction Company. It was formed in 578, and its first contract was to build a Buddhist temple. And Kongo Gumi has been operating ever since as a construction company. The first multinational corporation, as you probably all know, was the East India Company, founded in 1601. And it reigned supreme as the largest and most powerful corporation on earth for over 200 years before it was supplanted by other corporations coming up. But even with the primacy of the corporation, there are some challenges that are now very, very apparent. They did a study, for example, in, I think it was 1928, of the corporations on the S&P index, Standard & Poor's index in the US. And the average life expectancy of corporations then was about 79.5 years. When they did that same analysis of the S&P 2 years ago, they're finding that the average life of the S&P corporation now is less than 15 years. So when we think of the primacy of the corporation, we need to bear in mind that the corporations are as challenged by our hyper-complex, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world. And within that context, we have runaway climate change that is literally spinning out of control to a large degree because the corporations refuse to do anything about it. And the governments that they control are going at a snail's pace. So as we gather today on the 8th of December, 2020, in the midst of a pandemic that is digging in and not letting go, in the midst of global warming that even with the pandemic continues to spin out of control, the responsibility of the corporations is paramount. And that's what we're here to discuss, is how can the corporations, now leading political, social, and economic affairs in fundamental ways, how can they provide the kind of proactive, regenerative leadership that is no longer possible from governments or religions or other institutions? So that's our program for today, everyone. Thank you all for joining. And I would like to now turn it over to my good friend and colleague, Sabine van Gafka, who will commence our program. Sabine?
Thank you very much, Jim. And I also, of course, want to welcome all of our viewers from around the world and all of our streaming partners who join us each and every day of Humanity Rising to share and syndicate the content and the discussions that are happening here. And just as Jim said, yesterday we talked about AQ, which is adaptability quotient or quotient, and it's all about, how we can start to really integrate the trait of adaptability and flexibility, both as leaders, as individuals, as corporations, and as a society. And today we're going to dive more into, how do we reshape capitalism and what is the future role of corporations? As Jim also said, being proactive and having a regenerative leadership, but also really incorporating and integrating trust, because trust is really that foundational word that is not really in its purest form at this moment. And maybe that is where corporations and leaders can really start to engage in that with their employees, and of course also addressing the global problems that we have around the world, and really getting impact and social impact and culture integrated into the corporations as well. And today we're going to have, I'm sure of it, an interesting and very relevant dialogue with some of the legal profession's leading experts on corporate law, who will be having a conversation on how redesigned corporations are quietly reshaping capitalism. And this is going to be moderated by John Montgomery, who is president of Lex Ultima. And this is a company that understands the challenges that are involved in making the transformational journey from a traditional corporation into a benefit corporation. And Lex Ultima evolved out of a corporation law firm that represented traditional corporations, and today guides directors and officers and stakeholders or stockholders of public and private corporations through the process of becoming a benefit corporation. So before I hand over the world, well, that too, but above all, the word, I would like to just enable us all to become centered and open our hearts and our minds with just a 1-minute heart coherence meditation, using inhales and exhales just to arrive here and now in this space for conversations on solutions. Thank you all for sharing that moment of heart coherence. And with that, I hand over the word to John Montgomery and his panelists.
Thank you, Sabrina. Well, it wasn't really far from the truth that Sabrina is going to hand the world over to me this morning, in the sense that I get the pleasure of bringing all of you into what really is a global conversation about the future of the corporation. And I'm going to be as brief as possible today because I get to introduce you to some of the heroes and leaders of this global conversation to reshape the corporation. I got involved in this conversation back in 2008 when I was introduced to one of the founders of B-Lab, and we'll find out more about B-Lab, I'm sure, from Chris Marcus and some of the panelists. But that conversation in 2008 led me to being introduced to Bill Clark at some point in 2009 or so. And I ended up helping Bill a little bit on his white paper on the need and rationale for the benefit of corporation. And at that moment, in that process, I was ruined for my life as a traditional startup company lawyer in Silicon Valley, because I realized that the corporation as we know and love it has no social and environmental conscience. It's got a very primitive pecuniary conscience, because under Delaware law, its sole purpose is to maximize stockholder welfare. And the practice in the global economic system is to externalize as many of the negative costs of corporate behavior onto society and the environment. That's the process of, or the custom of, externalizing costs. So Bill Clark really changed my life. And when I look back at the course of my life, Bill is probably one of the most significant and important people in my life, because my life was forever changed. And I've been part of this global conversation on reshaping the corporation ever since. In 2010 and 11, I got brought into the process of getting California's benefit corporation legislation passed. That happened January 3rd, 2012. Companies like Patagonia were among the first to become benefit corporations. And shortly thereafter, I met Colin Mayer at Stanford Law School, where he was giving a talk about his book that was about to be published, Firm Commitment, which is about why the corporation is failing us and how to restore trust in it. Well, Sabrina mentioned that Lex Ultima helps traditional corporations become benefit corporations. That process is really difficult because corporations are advised by lawyers. Lawyers are trained to be risk averse. We swear oaths to maintain the status quo under our state laws. And it's very, very difficult to convince a corporation to become a benefit corporation, to change its charter. In the early days, now there are 10,000 benefit entities in the United States, but back in 2013, 14, 15, there were just a handful. And getting traditional corporations, and especially their boards of directors, to convert was really, really difficult. It could take a 2 or 3 year process of many, many conversations trying to convince people. And many of their lawyers were terrified of the new form because it was new. Well, I developed a board tool when I encountered the writing of Chief Justice Leo Strine from the Delaware Supreme Court. I put together board books. They're about 1.5 inches thick. And in this board book was Bill Clark's white paper on the need for the benefit corporation and a couple of Justice Strine's articles, one from Harvard Law Review. And I would present these board books to the directors at the board meeting where we were considering the conversion into a benefit corporation. And often I would say, well, you know, they would be afraid of the liability, perceived liability of this new corporate form. And I would sort of say, well, you guys have heard of Harvard Law School, right? And I would bring out this book and direct them to Chief Justice Strine's articles. And that often did the trick. So it's with great pleasure that one of my heroes for the last decade, Chief Justice Strine, is going to join us today. One of our other panelists, Constanza Connolly, is from Argentina. Connie invited Bill Clark and I to Patagonia a couple of years ago to present at an academic conference for Latin American lawyers who are interested in the B Corp. And we'll hear from Connie about Sistema B and the spread of the benefit corporation form in Latin America. And finally, Professor Marquis, has written the most marvelous book about the story of the benefit corporation and the B Corp movement, Better Business. It just came out. I couldn't put this book down because it's the story of all of us. In this book, you'll find the story of Sistema B, the B Corp, Justice Strine's in here. I mean, it's the story of the movement. So I'm thrilled to have Professor Marquis with us today. So sit down, enjoy the show. You are going to really understand the issues surrounding the global conversation about the future of the corporation after this event today. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to turn the microphone over to my good friend, Bill Clark.
Thank you, John. Hello, everyone. Richard, can I start the screen?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right, are we set, Richard?
You're good to go, Bill.
Thank you. So hello again, everyone. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to join you for this discussion. I have been asked to start off the discussion today with a review of two of the main concepts that will run throughout the discussion today. First of all, shareholder primacy, and secondly, an introduction to benefit corporation. So let's jump right in and review shareholder primacy. It's traditional when we talk about this notion of shareholder primacy to begin with Milton Friedman. Friedman wrote a very influential article that was published back in 1970. We actually just celebrated the 50th anniversary of Friedman's article. And it is the classic statement of the notion of shareholder primacy. Essentially, all you need to know about shareholder primacy is that it's the idea that directors, as they manage their corporation, are trusted with the job of making as much money as possible, while at the same time conforming to the basic rules that society expects of them. So those would be the rules embodied both in law as well as in ethical custom. So make as much money as possible while following the rules. Pretty simple, but before we leave this discussion of shareholder primacy, I'd like to spend a little bit of time putting Milton Friedman into context. And I'm very aware that what you're about to hear is a very simplified history and review of developments. It is in no way complete. It could take us more than a full day to run through all the implications of how the world and our view, particularly in the United States, has developed on these issues. But I think it's useful for us because there are some very intriguing questions that are raised by this history, and I think it helps to shape our understanding. So we'll begin by moving backwards from 1970, about 2 decades into the 1950s. And as we look back at the 1950s, we recognize that it was a period in the business world of what has been referred to as heroic managerialism. And it's particularly interesting from the context of what we're going to be talking about today, because although this notion of a benefit corporation, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, and the changes that we're seeing happen now, often seem like a new idea, in fact, there was a period back in the 1950s when much of business was actually conducted in the manner of a benefit corporation. And so I've given you just 2 examples of what people were saying back then. First of all, we've got here the Harvard Business School Alumni Association, and it's on record as saying that today, this would be in 1948, most corporate managements operate as trustees in recognition of the claims of employees, investors, consumers, and government. That certainly sounds very different than the notion of shareholder primacy and the job of directors being to only maximize profitability. Here's another example. This comes from Fortune magazine in 1951 in an article that Fortune published, where they were talking about the fact that the United States has produced a new kind of capitalism that neither Karl Marx nor Adam Smith would ever have dreamed of. And what they were doing in the article was quoting from Standard Oil of New Jersey's president, Frank Abrams. And Fortune reported that managers were increasingly conducting the affairs of their enterprise in such a way as to maintain an equitable and working balance among the claims of the various directly interested groups, stockholders, employees, customers, and the public at large. Stop and reflect on that for a moment and think about the world and what it would look like had that understanding of business continued straight from the 1950s through the next 70 years. In fact, what happened was a great deal of change. The 1950s moved into the 1960s. Of course, we remember the 60s as the time of the Vietnam War, the rise of hippies, a great cultural revolution, if you will. And that's not really our story for today. But what happened in the 1960s does lead us into 1970 when Friedman wrote. And what I think it's interesting to do is to reflect on the world of 1970. Yes, it was still a tumultuous time. We were still getting out of the Vietnam War in the United States. We had not yet hit the period of Watergate and the disruptions that it caused. But think about, in a broader sense, what was happening in our society. In 1970, the same year that Friedman wrote, President Nixon by executive order, established the Environmental Protection Agency. Remarkable, right? That a Republican president would do that. In the 60s, the Clean Air Act had already been enacted. The Clean Water Act would be enacted in about 2 years after 1970. So 2 of our major environmental laws were put on the books at that time. Global warming had not been identified as a problem. It's true that some scientists were aware of the greenhouse gas effect, but certainly nothing like the concern that we now have with global warming. Of course, this was also a period before China had begun its rapid industrialization and its massive consumption of fossil fuels. Moving from the environment to society more generally, in the 60s, the Civil Rights Act was enacted, the Voting Rights Act had been enacted. Lyndon Johnson had launched a war on poverty. There were major government programs designed to address important social issues. And at the same time, even looking at the business world more specifically, we find that although organized labor had its maximum influence and heyday in the 50s, believe it or not, the number of union members actually reached its peak in 1979. So here's Milton Friedman in 1970 articulating the notion that the job of business is to make as much money as possible while it follows the law. And you can imagine that, seen objectively, that notion against the background of the world of 1970 would not have seemed as extraordinary as it strikes us today, because Friedman could have said with a straight face to people, look, the government is taking care of things. The government is moving aggressively in the environmental area. We're moving to address social problems. We can rely on the influence of organized labor, take care of workers. And what directors should do is respect all of those developments, the law and the ethical custom as it was developing, but the directors should be paying attention to the profitability of their corporation. Now, let's track forward in history some more. And I want to take you to the 1980s and 3 thoughts in particular. First of all, I think that the Chicago School of Economics around 1980 was beginning to become the dominant understanding in American consciousness generally of the economy. 2 thoughts in particular that maybe summarize the Chicago School. One, a very strong belief that free markets best allocate the resources available to society. And secondly, that minimal or no government regulation is generally the best for developing and promoting an economy that would be most productive and beneficial for the citizens. And I think if you reflect on where we are even today, now 40 years later, that dominance of those ideas can still be seen very clearly in a lot of places in our society. At the same time, we also see, beginning in the 1980s, an increasing distrust of the government. And here, I can't resist calling to your attention a comment that Ronald Reagan made in 1986 at a news conference, where he said that the most terrifying words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." And I think that very nicely captures the distrust of big government that was beginning to develop. Certainly it was consistent with the Chicago School's understanding of reducing the role of government. And even today, reflect on the fact that over the last 4 years, we've seen a number of instances where the federal government, really the Trump administration, has reduced regulation and has pulled back from the involvement of the government in the economy. Now, at the same time, in the 1980s, we also see a massive change in the financial markets as most of our economy becomes much more financialized. We see the rise of institutional investors particularly driven by changes in pension schemes, the rise of 401ks, more and more of the future security of our society and workers are dependent on the stock market and those kinds of investments. At the same time, the rise of institutional investors and the concentration of ownership in their hands made the idea of the Wall Street walk less useful. Prior to the 1980s, the accepted wisdom was that if you didn't like the way a stock was performing, you simply sold your position and walked over to another investment and reallocated your resources. But with the rise of institutional investors, that became less viable as a strategy. The institutional investors became dominant players, and all of this is happening at the same time that we're pulling back from government regulation, and we are beginning to embrace the idea that the government is too big and should not be trusted. At the same time, some of us might say even perversely, some of the role of institutional investors has begun at this point to start to create problems that we're only now seeing coming to fruition. In the 1980s, it seemed like a good idea that executive compensation should be aligned with market performance. Now we see that that's a major driver of income inequality and lots of problems that follow from it. So seen in all of this context, we now begin to understand where we are. And now the question for us is, what does society do to move in a new and different direction? So let's move to the second topic of benefit corporations. Very briefly, a benefit corporation should be understood as a type of business corporation. It's not something entirely new. Instead, the way the benefit corporation statutes are constructed, all of the rules that apply to general business corporations apply to benefit corporations, except to the extent that there are specific rules that set forth the differences that make benefit corporations different from business corporations. But leaving aside the differences, all of the rules on corporate governance that have developed in the general business corporation context apply to benefit corporations. So for example, shareholders still elect the directors of the corporation. It's just that the directors, when elected, are now going to be directors of a benefit corporation instead of a business corporation. And there are a variety of other similar issues that we could point out. But the one other thing that I want to mention at the moment is that benefit corporation status is optional. It's not something that can be done unilaterally by the board of directors. To become a benefit corporation requires approval of the shareholders. So the owners of the business have to embrace the idea of a benefit corporation. So what is a benefit corporation? There are three major distinctives of a benefit corporation. First of all, a change in its purpose. Secondly, a change in the duties of its directors. And third, a new reporting obligation. Let's talk about each of those very briefly. In a benefit corporation, the purpose of the corporation is redefined by statute. And what the statutes do is to add a purpose of having a positive impact on society and the environment, taken as a whole, from the business and operations of the corporation. So effectively what you have then is a business corporation that when it becomes a benefit corporation, it's taking its existing purpose of being financially profitable and it's adding to that a focus on having a positive impact on society and the environment. So there's now a focus on profitability, society, and the environment. But then a benefit corporation is also permitted to elect a specific purpose in addition to its general commitment to financial profitability and society and the environment. There are two major models of benefit corporation statutes that you'll find in the United States. What I've just described to you is wording that comes from the more prevalent model, but there is another model that was developed by Delaware and is also found in 5 other states which is framed somewhat differently, but still carries these same basic elements. In the Delaware model, there is more of a focus on having a specific purpose that the corporation is to follow. But at the same time, the Delaware statute requires that every benefit corporation, actually Delaware refers to them as public benefit corporations, must behave in a way that is responsible and sustainable. So it's the same basic notion of a commitment to responsible and sustainable behavior generally. Okay, that was the first characteristic. The second change that sets benefit corporations apart is the duties of directors. And what's different here is that in a benefit corporation, the directors and officers are required by statute to consider both environmental issues and the interest of stakeholders beyond just the shareholders. And that, of course, makes sense in the context of the broadened purpose of a benefit corporation. And then finally, there is a requirement that a benefit corporation prepare a report that describes how it has performed in its pursuit of its broadened purpose. And that annual report is required to be made publicly available. It's not just available for the shareholders. So to summarize, benefit corporation is a business corporation in which the directors are focused on the triple bottom line. So in addition to the traditional focus on financial profitability, there's also a focus on the impact on people and the planet. So hence the common reference to the 3 Ps of profits, people, and planet. But what's most important, I think, is that the positive impact that a benefit corporation seeks to create is intended to come from the manner in which the benefit corporation conducts its business and operations. The idea is not that a benefit corporation will adopt a specific mission and seek to accomplish that mission, but not care about how it runs its operations more generally. In essence, benefit corporations are not about the what, but rather about the how. It actually doesn't matter what kind of economic activity a benefit corporation engages in. The question is, how does it conduct business in a responsible way? So I'd like to take a few minutes now at the end of my remarks to ask you to consider some questions very briefly. And I think you will see some of these questions run through the subsequent discussion today, and hopefully others will stick with you and you'll continue to ponder them after this session. So, first question for you. Is it actually the right way, when we think about reforming capitalism, to think about changing shareholder primacy? Or alternatively, is it better to think about the issue being shareholder wealth maximization? Related to this question of shareholder primacy, people often speak of the current system being shareholder primacy and the system we're looking for to be stakeholder capitalism. But my question for you is, do we really want a system of true stakeholder capitalism where the non-shareholder stakeholders, either singly or all collectively together, are of equal importance to the shareholders in the minds of the directors? You should reflect on whether that's really the world that we want and that will continue to profitably provide for our needs as a society. Related to that is the question of, do the people providing the capital in fact need to have pride of place in the director's consideration? Note in this regard that very few people are actually proposing that stakeholders be given an effective say in enforcing their interests. Even in Delaware, its rules still deny non-shareholder stakeholders standing to challenge the interest of directors, which suggests that even in the Delaware, the benefit corporation model, they're not really changing primacy itself, if you understand primacy to be the factor that is most important. Some way, somehow, still the shareholders and the stockholders of the corporation have a greater call on the consideration of the directors than do the other stakeholders. But I leave that to you to think about. Similarly, we need to ask ourselves if we're creating a system where directors are determining how their corporation is going to pursue impact, how are the shareholders going to be able to police the actions of the director? Remember that we were just talking about the fact that we're not giving stakeholders the right to enforce their interests directly. We're relying still on the shareholders, but how will the shareholders police the actions of the directors? In fact, we're starting to see investors worrying that directors will be given too much freedom under one of these new understandings of the purpose of the corporation. Sometimes the answer that is suggested is a stronger and greater emphasis on purpose itself. And perhaps that is the answer, and I know that we'll be talking about that later in the day. And if we think that's the case, what input do we propose shareholders should have in setting that purpose? And then more broadly, how can we, in fact, be comfortable in thinking that corporations, if they all adopt a clearer purpose, will necessarily all act in a way that will bring us to a point where we can actually solve society's problems, since each corporation will be free to act in its own way when, in fact, perhaps maybe more broadly coordinated action is necessary. So that leads me to ask you the question of whether an alternative approach that we should consider would be a system that enforces a minimum level of acceptable behavior for all corporations and allows directors to focus still primarily on financial performance. Remember Milton Friedman and law and ethical custom? Perhaps what the law needs to do is set more clearly what minimum acceptable levels of behavior will be for all corporations acting in our economy. Although that raises the question of how do we deal with our current fractured politics and our understanding of our economy? Can we maintain the popular commitment to unfettered free markets and distrust of government? Or in fact, ultimately, are we going to need government to become again more of a player, bring back some regulation, because it's not going to effectively be enough to just bring individual corporations into a new understanding of their behavior? And finally, I want to leave you with this particularly interesting thought. If you think about the world in which we currently live, more and more people are dependent on private investments to fund their retirement. The whole notion of defined benefit pension plans has gone by the wayside. In fact, you're seeing more and more discussions of privatizing the ability of people to manage their 401ks, and in fact, even privatizing parts of Social Security. And if we move in that direction, think about how you would feel as a 60-year-old or even a 50-year-old looking at your impending retirement and wondering, in fact, how you're going to survive and how your investments are going to perform. And I suspect, and I suggest to you, that more and more people will be focused directly on maximizing their financial performance within their 401ks. So lots of interesting problems and issues. That brings me to the end of my section. I think, Connie, I'm supposed to turn it over to you, unless, John, you'd like to join the discussion briefly at this point.
No, I think take it away. Thank you, Bill.
Okay, thank you, Bill. Thank you for the presentation, and I'm really delighted to be joining together today. I'm from Argentina, as it was mentioned. I'm from a group of lawyers that are located in Latin America. What I'm going to share with you is how is the benefit corporation are reshaping capitalism in Latin America. Thus, Bill has mentioned and explained the evolution in the US that I'm not going to share the evolution in Latin America, but it's really quite similar, of the evolution from the traditional vision looking for a shareholder primacy and the new vision of a stakeholder primacy. This evolution from a legal perspective and the legal structures, we do not have regulations, we do not have these model hybrids, and we have in Latin America in general, in all the jurisdictions, for-profit organizations or companies and non-for-profit organizations. As you may see in this presentation, we have on the right side what is the public interest, where we have public institutions in general, NGOs. On the other side, on the left hand, we have the traditional company that was mentioned before by Bill at the beginning of the presentation, and all the other ones that have, and it was mentioned in the chat also, the corporate social responsibility, companies that are having CSR responsibility. This is where we have the hybrid interest, but we do not have this hybrid model organization that are searching and looking for a purpose. So in Latin America, we may say that we have social enterprises movement that is really a big movement, triple bottom line companies that was mentioned by Bill, but we are also having the benefit corporation. What is going on in Latin America? Well, I was very happy when John mentioned in the relation with Bill and John that we have in Latin America. Bill is like our also is like we call the godfather, we may say. He has helped all Latin America legislation in order to start with the movement that was beginning with Sistema B. We have getting together in 2015, so we have 5 years until now, working and collaborating with the Sistema B movement and the B Lab movement. As you may know, Sistema B is the regional representation of B Lab. And when we gather together, we say, well, how we are going to mention and to be named these benefit corporations in Latin America. And that's where we decided that the name should be Sociedades de Beneficio de Interés Colectivo. This means that they are for-profit legal entities that already exist in a legal system, because we are not creating new model. We are like using the formats and the legal formats of for-profit entities. Unlike other purpose-driven company models and not-for-profit entities, the big companies are for-profit models that can distribute profits to their shareholders. But one of the main characteristics of this model, and here I'm not going to mention the 3 main characteristics that were mentioned by Bill that are applying in the movement in Latin America, consists of the assignment of a legal mandate by which shareholders and administrators must seek a public benefit simultaneously with the generation of profit. So we are talking about, as was mentioned before, of a public benefit here. This model, as I mentioned before, the big companies model, derives from the legal figure of the US. So we are working with the white paper of Bill. We are having like a free adaptation of this, with varies, of course, according to the legal system of the countries. Latin America is we have a lot of countries and jurisdictions working on this. And there are a lot of legal innovation made, of course, to adjust the essential elements and main characteristics mentioned by Bill of the benefit corporation to different local contexts. The big companies, and I mentioned, are the Latin American answer to the benefit corporation model. I may say that there are multiple ways of how the legislation has been passed in the other countries in Latin America, but all of them have the presence of lawyers. And these lawyers have been gathered together by Sistema B. Sistema B have co-founded what is called here in Latin America, where Network for Impact Lawyers, that is mentioned there, the Red Latinoamericana de Abogados de Impacto. We are all promoting this bill of law for big companies with the aim of promoting a new impact economy and to replicate, of course, the main and essential elements of the benefit corporations that are in the US. In Latin America, I may say that there are now 3 countries that already approved the benefit corporation law, the big law, as I mentioned before. Those are Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. There are other 4 countries that have already filed and are in discussion in the Congress. which are Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil. I may say, and this is really, I have made a publication that I am going to share afterwards in the chat, but it is in Spanish, taking the consideration of the legislative movement in the region, that in Latin America, this region has a great dynamism in the terms of debate around the concept of purpose companies. There is no other regional and international movement for the introduction of a bill of law like the BIC in other countries and in other continents. There are three main characteristics: that there was totally spontaneous, there was an open and collaborative work that have been working throughout the entire region. This movement, as I mentioned before, in the region is only one. We are all working together. We are all working, all the countries, and Bill is collaborating, as I mentioned before, with us. But it also presents a common challenge, it's an opportunity mainly for its implementation. We have, as I mentioned, this legislation that have already passed through and have been approved, have 2 years. I think the Colombia is the oldest one. So we are now in the phase of implementing this new regulation. No? It has also the challenges of articulating and establishing a strategy to resolve around common principles that provide the legal basis for this new way of doing business with a legal recognition. But we are also looking for a regional identification. We want to have a regional benefit corporation law. What I would like to say is that we are working very hard on this, but even though all these efforts, we believe that we need a joint and coordinated effort among all the ecosystems actors in each country and also in the region. That is necessary in order to provide purpose-driven company, as the B Corps was mentioned before, that impact and responsible investors have an adequate legal framework to promote and accelerate this new business model. In all the Latin America, we have a lack of trust, in the governments. So it's really very, very important. Bill has shared with us what was the market and the government. And in Latin America, the governments are really, with their regulations, most of them, generating a lot of lack of trust for the companies. I'm talking, of course, in our situation that you may know in Argentina. So we need to have adequate legal framework to promote this new business model, this new way of doing business. And we need also to encourage ESG approach for companies and investors. ESG approach in the region is also very, very low and it's not coordinated. So we really need to work on that also in order to promote the benefit corporations. We need to foster education on these topics. It is needed to promote them and also eventually to encourage systemic national regulations and policies. We need more regulations and policies and recognitions from the government of this way of doing business. And we also need to encourage the development of public and private organisms for the implementation and control of these companies. What I'm talking about is that we should not depend on the state, and we have many discussions with Bill. It's the private organizations who should collaborate with implementation and the control in order to give them incentives, for example, in order to promote this new business model of benefit corporation. I believe there is a huge opportunity for the Latin American region in order to attract impact investing required to solve the social problems, environmental problems that we are having today. Latin America have a lot of good business news, entrepreneurships, and we need to focus more on Latin America's regulation and recognition of this new model in order to attract impact investing and responsible impact investing. I would like then to share with you, and I'm going to put it on the chat, the information about Academia B, that is a partner of Sistema B on education, as mentioned by John, that we are working a lot in order to recognize and talk about this new business model. I'm open to the questions before. I like very much the questions that were suggested by Bill, and I give the floor to Chris. Chris, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Constanza. Thank you all for being here. It's really so amazing and such an honor to be part of this event with such a distinguished panel. So as John mentioned in the opening, what I'm going to be talking to you about is my new book, Better Business, How the B Corp Movement is Remaking Capitalism. And in this book, I focus on how we can shift from a system that is very much focused on shareholders. So, this already came up in Bill's talk, also in Constanza's, to one that is more reliably and authentically focused on all stakeholders, employees, communities, the environment, et cetera. It's worth noting that even before the pandemic, there was a groundswell of support for stakeholder management. You might be familiar with the Business Roundtable, leading group of 200 largest company CEOs in the United States. They changed their statement of the purpose of the corporation to be focused on all stakeholders, not just shareholders. The World Economic Forum also had its theme for 2020 and the meeting in January before the pandemic on stakeholders. And of course, Larry Fink, one of the largest investors of the world, has been advocating companies take sustainability and purpose more seriously. Now, one could say these are just talk, and there is examples of, for instance, Business Roundtable companies being taken to task because they're saying they want to be about stakeholders, but then actually, post-pandemic, their actions are very much focused on their shareholders. And I don't disagree with this, but I do think actually the fact that all of these leading actors are saying that this is important is significant, because to overcome the short-termism that has really resulted in many economic, social problems like economic inequality, like Bill mentioned, externality abuses, like John mentioned in his opening comments, companies focused on short-term share price, not on pollution, waste, et cetera. For us to really actually reorient the system, people have to recognize that actually there is an issue. And so I think that all of these folks coming out and saying we need to focus more on stakeholders, I think helps communicate that message. However, what I write about in the book is that saying things is a lot easier than doing them. I think the intentions are great, but what business needs are tools and processes to become more stakeholder driven. Certainly one of these is the benefit corporation governance model that Bill, Constanza have talked about, and I'm going to talk about some other ones as well. And without this, it's very easy to slip back to much more of a shareholder focus, where greenwashing, where companies are just saying positive things without actually doing them, is rampant. So the book, where I focus on a number of these tools and processes, focuses on the B Corp movement, which is something that I think unites a number of our speakers today. And this B Corp phenomena, where companies are certified for their social and environmental impact, is hugely important to the world of sustainable business. But there's still only 3,500 of these companies. Many well-known companies, from Patagonia to Ben & Jerry's, Danone. 27 of Danone's subsidiaries are certified as B Corps, and actually the Danone global company is committed to becoming a B Corp by 2025. The message of the book is not that there should be more B Corps. I certainly support and think companies should transition to B Corp if that works for them. But it is a very rigorous assessment. The governance threshold is very steep for many companies, and so the number of B Corps will always be relatively small. But what is important is through the tools, processes that have been created through this movement, all companies can become more stakeholder oriented in a fundamental way. So let me talk about a few of those. So pillar one is tracking, measuring, and being transparent. To authentically implement stakeholder management, you need stakeholder management tools and reporting processes. This is something that many commentators that are really against a move away from the Friedman shareholder primacy model say, well, if companies are accountable to everyone, they're accountable to no one. That is absolutely true. And that is why that we need to actually have accountability to stakeholders. And that starts with tracking, measuring, and companies being transparent. This is part of the benefit corporation governance model, which Bill had mentioned, but let me say a little bit more about the separate tools. There's a number of different ways for companies to do this. There's SASB, the Sustainability Accountable Standards Board, which actually Larry Fink mentions in his letters to CEOs, telling them to be more sustainable. Global Reporting Initiative, another sort of well-known sort of set of tools and processes for companies to be more transparent. These tools open the firm to public scrutiny, identify areas of improvement. The one associated with the B Corp movement, the B impact assessment, I think is particularly useful because it is not only rigorous and comprehensive, but it's actually a learning tool. So going through it, companies can benchmark what other organizations are doing and actually learn how to be better. This is why I actually titled my book Better Business, because when I started interviewing companies, many of them would say, we got into this movement because we believed in the social and environmental component of it. We wanted to be better on those aspects, but it turns out going through the process of the B impact assessment, we became better businesses overall. In some ways, it's sort of like a cookbook for good management. So as a result, it's not just B Corps that use this tool. Over 100,000 other companies are using it to measure what matters and actually effectively organize their business. A number of other sort of investors and banks actually use it as part of their due diligence. So for instance, one example, the Business Development Bank of Canada, when organizations go to this company, go to this bank to borrow money, they actually have to go through a version of the B impact assessment so the Business Development Bank of Canada can sort of understand the situation of the organization and way it can improve. I think also a number of venture capital companies are using it for due diligence. And I think this is something that's very important, that a number of investors have actually taken on purpose and these socially driven businesses in a way that is surprising, given at least when I started studying this 15 years ago, when the idea was that no investor would really voluntarily, for market reasons, focus on these companies. And a number of B Corps have gone public recently, including Lemonade, which is an online insurer, Vital Farms, and App Harvest. So these are companies that have stakeholder-driven governance, are certified B corporations, and the public markets are actually treating them very well. What I think is actually a bigger deal, and this relates to the PBC, the Public Benefit Corporation changes that Bill had mentioned. Actually, there are companies that are changing existing companies changing their articles of incorporation through shareholder vote. So this is not like a venture capital company investing in a social purpose business. This is not investors in IPO where they know the company is a B Corp, but these are existing companies that are changing their articles of incorporation. Danone, French company, is one example that has done this. Amalgamated Bank in the United States is another. These two organizations both passed these changes with over 99% of the vote. In January, what I think is going to be actually a pretty revolutionary event, a company called Viva Systems. It's a cloud computing company in the healthcare area, is taking a shareholder vote to become a public benefit corporation. To my knowledge, this is the first time where shareholders are going to be voting on adopting this, the public shareholders on a major exchange, adopting this governance method. So the second pillar is about governance, benefit corporation law, and this new type of company. I think Bill and Constanza to some extent covered this well, so I'll skip that part of my book. Another pillar is actually working together in collective action. It's so inspiring to me the way that B corporations and other socially focused businesses work together to create positive impact beyond just the company. Many of these organizations, I've been studying this now for about 15 years, have been smaller. And this is also seen as sort of a critique. But I think that, more recently, as larger companies have come on board, the way that they've actually worked together to show how these models, these tracking models like B impact assessment, governance models like benefit corporation governance can be useful for large companies has really been inspiring. So, recently 6 companies got together with B Lab, 6 large companies, multinational companies, including Danone, Also Natura, which is a Brazilian-based natural cosmetics company that owns The Body Shop, that owns Avon, and 2 other European and 2 other Brazilian companies actually began a program where they're actually going to be using the B impact assessment to certify their business and actually work in a new way towards B Corp certification. What was surprising about that list when I heard about it to me was that, well, I guess maybe not, unsurprising, is that there's no American companies. And I think that, while this movement very much started in the US, started passing these benefit corporation laws in many US states, which is, spread internationally to Italy and a number of the South American countries that was just shown, also to British Columbia in Canada. But I do think that actually the center of gravity of this movement is going to be shifting to Europe and Latin America, because sort of the styles of capitalism in those areas I think are much more attuned with this purpose driven business that the B Corporation and benefit corporations represent. I think another thing that's very important on this sort of working together collective action idea is orienting around the UN Sustainable Development Goals. I think this is, these 17 goals that are so important for governments, societies, humanity to reach by 2030, are important. However, I think one limitation is that they're not sort of operationalized in some ways for companies. And I think that, sort of a little blind spot from the UN's work is that they haven't really recognized just how powerful leading global businesses are. I mean, companies like, Walmart, their, sales are larger than the GDP of countries like Belgium. It would be a top 10 country. And I think, actually finding ways to bring business to the table into the SDGs is very important. I think one thing that's been done around this is there's been a syncing of the SDGs and the B impact assessment. It's called the SDG Action Manager. So the companies can sort of understand better which SDGs they have the biggest impact on, and then actually work to improve along those areas. And many companies now are aligning around SDGs, Danone being an example. So the final pillar in the book that I want to close with is the importance of consumers. Now, this is an SDG in and of itself, SDG number 12 around responsible consumption. As business leaders, citizens, through the products and services that we support, that we buy, that we consume responsibly, can have a huge impact on the world. Studies have shown that, around the world, that people actually care about and want to buy from brands that are in companies that are doing good in the world. But it's actually really hard to know which companies those are, with the rampant greenwashing and many examples of companies that say they're doing one thing and not doing the other. I think this is where the B Corp certification is very useful and comes in, also benefit corporation governance. And sort of my final thing, I just want to leave us with, in some ways, a call for action. I hope that, all of us who are watching this and on the call can think, as we make our purchases, particularly going into what is a holiday season when there is a lot of consumption, that the dollars we spend, or whatever currency, euro, pound, whatever, can help play a greater role in the development of a sustainable economy, and really think about using our purchases to make the world better. So with that, I believe that Colin is up next. And Colin, why don't you take it away?
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed, Christopher. And I'll continue this romp around the world from North America to South America and now to Europe. Well, actually, you've ended up in the UK, which is sort of currently mid-Atlantic, I think, to be precise. Jim mentioned Congo Gumi as being the oldest corporation in the world. The corporation was originally invented under Roman law some 2,000 years ago as the Societas Publicanorum. And that body was designed to perform very public functions in Rome of collecting taxes, minting coins, and maintaining public buildings, basically because there was a great deal of distrust or mistrust in governments performing that function. And that notion of a public function for the corporation was then taken up in subsequent centuries in the corporation becoming municipalities, managing urban conurbations, and in religion with the Catholic Church being a corporation. And so for much of its history, the corporation has actually been predominantly a public body, which then, for various reasons, accumulated commercial functions around that structure. And that notion of the origination of the purpose of the corporation is quite important to bear in mind, because I think one of the key issues that arises in this area is to be precise about what we mean by the purpose of a business. Because there's been a great deal of confusion on this topic. There's not so much a question now of whether or why companies should adopt a purpose. It's more a matter of what is a purpose and how should companies really embed it in their business. And the notion that the purpose of a business is why it exists, why it's created, its reason for being, is all true, but it doesn't really help many companies to identify precisely what that purpose is. And so I think it's important to understand that it's not just that the Friedman doctrine of the one and only social purpose of business being to increase profit so long as it stays within the rules of the game being inappropriate. It's that having a notion of a purpose that is precisely defined beyond that is critical. And the way in which I argue that one needs to think about that is that business is there to solve problems that you and I as individuals and societies face and the natural world faces, but to do so in a particular form, and that is to do so in a commercially viable, profitable, and financially sustainable way. And that in so doing, that notion of profit is one that should exclude profiting at the expense of or producing problems for either people or planet. And that double element is extremely important in terms of thinking about how one addresses many of the issues associated with the failure of companies really to get to grips with problems. And to illustrate the notion that just having a public purpose may not be adequate, one only has to think about what was referred to as one of the largest corporations in the world, the East India Company, and to read William Dalrymple's book on the East India Company to realize how a supposed publicly focused corporation can turn into a ravaging psychopathic institution that causes immense damage, not least through, of course, exploiting the slave trade. So it is very important, I think, to understand what we're trying to do, where we're trying to get to, and to understand the important role that law plays in this process, because law defines the company. Company is a legal fiction, and it has to then be the law that determines the way in which we want business to operate. It's not a sufficient condition, but it is a necessary condition for getting to the right place. Now, to come to the European case and what's going on there, well, actually, the EU is in many respects taking a more aggressive stance in relation to changing that notion of business more than virtually any other area in the world. It takes the form of the EU taxonomy in relation to climate change and setting out 6 pillars by which companies are going to require to demonstrate that they don't cause environmental problems in any of them, and demonstrate positive benefit in relation to at least one of them, which is very much along the lines of what I was defining as a purpose, as not profiting from producing problems, and also having that positive element in addition. And there's recently been a study done on directors' duties and corporate governance, which has identified 7 key problems about directors' duties being too narrowly defined and short-term in nature, growing pressure from investors on short-term horizons, a lack of strategic perspective over sustainability, board remuneration that's too focused on short-term, composition of boards that don't fully support sustainability, etc., etc. And so the EU has basically set out 3 options for addressing this, one of which is what they term a soft approach, a non-legislative approach of encouraging better practice through communication and things like that. I don't think the European Commission is very impressed with that. An intermediate approach that fosters some regulatory initiatives at orienting companies towards more sustainable practices, and a hard legislative approach of setting common rules, at least minimum rules, to enhance the creation of long-term value. And the inclination that comes out of that report is very much to progress the last of those. Now that's raising a pretty active debate, as you can imagine, with some countries where Britain to remain in Europe, I'm sure it would be one of the most active opponents of that particular approach. But on the other hand, there are some countries in Europe that are particularly at the forefront of pushing in this direction, not least France, where the Loire Pact places the notion of raison d'etre, which is essentially purpose, at the heart of the French Civil Code, and introduces a new corporate form, it's termed a société à mission, which is a sort of social enterprise, which also has some public benefit corporation elements associated with it. So France has gone particularly far in terms of embedding the notion of reform in law. It was mentioned that Italy has become one of the first countries outside the US to adopt a public benefit corporation. And Denmark has had for some time a legal form that in many respects is the most progressive of all, which is a legal form around the notion of an industrial foundation by which companies are actually owned by a foundation, and where some of the largest companies in Europe like Bertelsmann, Bosch, Carlsberg, IKEA and Velux have that corporate form. Now, the UK's approach has been rather different. It's eschewed, to date at least, legal reform, partly because it believes that its legal structure in the form of a company law that requires directors of companies to take account of the interests of other stakeholders in promoting the success of the company for the benefit of its directors, of its shareholders. Now, although that goes some way towards promoting the interests of other stakeholders, it is only in regard to promoting the interests of the success of the company for the benefit of its shareholders. And so the notion of a purpose that goes beyond shareholder interests is something that is not at present enshrined in British company law. But where the UK has taken a particularly strong lead is in relation to corporate governance reform. And that's quite important because the UK, in some respects, led the world in terms of corporate governance reform when in 1992, the Cadbury Committee set out proposals for corporate governance reform, which became the basis of corporate governance codes around the world, including in the OECD Corporate Governance Code. Now, that notion of corporate governance was around the idea, which was basically a straightforward shareholder view of the firm, that corporate governance was about aligning the interests of directors with those of their shareholders. But in 2018, the Corporate Governance Code in Britain was changed to require the boards of companies to establish their purposes, strategies, and values and ensure that they are all aligned with each other and the culture of the company. And furthermore, that the board had a responsibility to demonstrate that the company had the resources that are required to deliver on its purpose and to measure its performance by its achievement of its purposes. Now that sums up pretty well what one's looking for companies to do in terms of defining a purpose, recognizing that that purpose is not corporate social responsibility. It is core to the business. It should be the overarching emphasis on the strategy of the business. And that strategy has to be reflected in the values of the business and its culture and in the way in which it measures performance and the way in which it rewards people in the organization. So if the impact of that reform of corporate governance is to push companies to do that, then it could have a really quite significant impact on the behavior of companies. And furthermore, another area where the UK is in many respects leading the charge is in terms of institutional investor behavior by setting out a stewardship code that seeks to promote the role of institutional investors in not only promoting the interests of their beneficiaries, their investors, but also to recognize their responsibility in stewarding companies in which they're investing by overseeing the fulfillment of the corporate governance code, including that emphasis on the enactment of corporate purpose in companies. So that twin approach of requiring boards to do it, requiring institutional investors to take responsibility for stewarding companies in doing it, that could be a pretty powerful way of shifting behavior. But it actually requires companies and institutions to do that. And in that regard, the Financial Reporting Council, which is the body that's responsible for the change in the corporate governance code and overseeing this, is requiring companies to annually report on the fulfillment of their purposes. And it's going to be looking to institutional investors increasingly, similarly, to report on and measure their performance against the stewardship code. Now, I think that that is significant, but I do think that legal reform is important as well, because as I mentioned, the law defines what a company is. And so long as there's an inconsistency between corporate governance, stewardship, and law, then there is still a failure to really embed the notion of purpose in business. Now, I think the development that's taken place in relation to the public benefit corporation, in particular in the US, is very significant in that regard. However, and this is something that Christopher mentioned, if you just look at B Corps, which are, it's not the same as a public benefit corporation, there are some 3,500 of those, but those are almost entirely predominantly small companies. And therefore, the extent to which one might expect the public benefit corporation to be adopted by large companies is going to be modest, because there's a real free rider problem here. There's a problem in terms of achieving the support of investors in terms of bringing about the necessary change. And so Leo Strine, who's going to speak after me, and Jaap Winter, a European legal academic, and I wrote an article in the Fortune magazine suggesting that actually when you think about this in regard to large corporations, if you really want to bring about legal reform, then it's not so much the small end that's the problem, where companies can indeed elect ab initio to be public benefit corporations. It's going to be shifting the large corporations where one might actually require it to become a requirement for large corporations to adopt something like a public benefit corporation. And let me just end by shifting out of Europe into the emerging market context. We've heard something about South America, but in many parts of the world, there is considerable concern about moving the nature of business beyond anything other than a focus on financial returns. And that's sometimes heard also in relation to what's been going on recently in the developed world in relation to COVID-19. And that is that a focus on anything other than profits is fine in a developed country context, or when the world's going well, it's essentially a rich country privilege or a good times, fair weather feature of the business sector. But forget it in parts of the world that are just trying to establish themselves, or companies that are facing financial collapse. Well, I think actually the importance of purpose is exactly the opposite. It's particularly important in the context of emerging markets and in the context of crises, for the reason of the definition of a purpose that I gave you about solving problems, okay? And solving problems in ways that are commercially viable. Because what that does is to encourage companies to focus on opportunities that are created either where existing firms don't exist, or when new problems emerge, as in crises. And that is exactly what one has seen amongst the most successful respondents to COVID-19. That in essence, what a purpose does, where that purpose is recognized as being about solving problems, that it encourages innovation in companies to try and identify innovative ways of solving new problems. And just to give one illustration of a country that is recognizing or beginning to recognize this, India was really quite resistant until recently to the adoption of sustainability goals in its corporate sector for the reasons that I mentioned previously, but has now been, I think, quite effectively persuaded that if anything, it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity for India to be able to take a lead in addressing these newly emerging sustainability issues. And I emphasize this because I think that ultimately what is going to give rise to a fundamental shift in business over the next few years is that a recognition if one has clarity over purpose, a real commitment to the delivery of those solutions, it becomes the source of the most valuable asset that a company can create. And that is to become trustworthy, to be trusted by other parties, by its customers, by its employees, by its communities, by its suppliers. And that in turn is the basis of the commercial success of businesses. At this point, I'm supposed to hand over to my co-author and good friend, Leo.
Thank you, Colin. And everyone has my permission who's stayed with us this long to drink. It's a long session and it's very interesting to listen to my fellow speakers. I'm going to try to be kind of crisp and let you get out of here, but I'm gonna give you a more political, to be honest, perspective, focusing on what real world action could potentially happen in the coming year. And I'm going to cover some issues fairly quickly. On the B Corp front, there are promising developments in the US capital markets. The leading B Corp statute, Delaware, which one of the good members of the chat room said, is there a focus on environment? As Bill pointed out, that is a specific requirement in Delaware. Delaware lowered the gates to convert to a simple majority. There are several promising B Corps that are on the verge of going public, but the lowering to 50% really makes it feasible. I want to pivot to something that's been totally under discussed in this excellent program, which is the role of institutional investors. Every time that we beat up on the companies that make real products and deliver real services and that employ people without mentioning the fact that they're beholden to huge institutional investors who are in fact the fiduciaries for most ordinary people in the US and increasingly through the world are forced to invest, if they're lucky enough to have money to save for retirement, through intermediaries. These intermediaries are starting to talk a good game. I applaud that, but their actions are well behind their rhetoric. And many of them talk a game in public, but pressure and support activist campaigns and other things that put downward pressure on the lives of working people and on the ability of good companies to do things right. Because when the worst are rewarded by the market, that encourages people to go towards the worst elements of their nature. And so institutional investors, those of you who hung in here, do not let them off the hook. They have to be part of the equation. And if you don't, then you're just full of hot air, because the idea that the governed can be better than the electorate is not realistic. Global. I'm going to cover some US stuff. And maybe before I would, there was a name that wasn't mentioned, a chat person mentioned, Lewis Powell. Lewis Powell is famous as a Supreme Court justice, but he should be even more famous for the person who asked the US Chamber of Commerce and American businesses to go to war on the New Deal, Great Society protections, the kinds of things that in Europe you would call European social democracy. Milton Friedman was no adherent to the New Deal consensus. I thought the remarks of my friend Bill Clark were great, but he made fun of environmentalism in 1970. He made fun of racial equality concerns on the part of business. He made fun of working. He called, if you read his article in 1970, he called those three considerations hobby horses or something of the contemporary crop of reformers. Well, think about where the US and the world is today. Racial equality, a hobby horse? Well, we're still 50 years later, and because of Reagan and Friedman, we're worse off than we were at the end of the 1970s. Workers have gone backwards, and we have the existential threat to our species and our planet of climate change. And Lewis Powell and Friedman urged corporate America to go to war on the social welfare state and on the protections that were there to ensure that workers were treated fairly, that the environment was respected, and that consumers were protected. So part of the whole genesis for the benefit corporation movement and for those of us who support change within corporate governance is recognizing that corporate power unleashed on society has made it difficult for society to protect, to pass laws. And by the way, a Springer Spaniel, this is a very COVID moment group, a Springer Spaniel has joined us, it's made it impossible to get to keep the protections external for stakeholders. That's important. So how do you go about that? After some level of frustration, I think people said, we got to go within the corporation itself. And by the way, this also, the business community has been active in supporting right-wing activist judges who, when legislation to protect folks got through the Congress, it was struck down. Chief Justice Roberts saved the Affordable Care Act, really? In an extraordinary act, he extorted votes to just save a very easy part that any lawyer would tell you was the easiest part to sustain, and he struck down the Medicaid expansion, denying tens of millions of Americans access to affordable health. He struck down the Voting Rights Act extension. He struck down the restrictions on corporate political spending. They struck down the access to contraception that was afforded to people under the Affordable Care Act. And they've struck down many environmental regulations. So changing the power dynamic within corporate law matters. The benefit corporation movement is part of that. Part of what it does, as my friend Colin says, is it requires you to articulate a purpose, to be a good corporate citizen in two senses, have a positive purpose, but also to do no harm. Now, there's something that we also need to talk about. We haven't talked a lot about workers. On the, what I call the pour over coffee left, you know, my friends in the Bay Area in San Francisco or New York, for whom Starbucks or Pete's is not fancy enough, and you have to have a little bit of, thing that's poured over some filter. They didn't talk much about workers. And one of the problems we have in our nations is a divide between the working class and other people on the left. And part of why I don't use EESG, I say EESG or EESG, is because the workers should not be buried in the S, which is where the pour over coffee crowd put them, and an investor focused approach to reform. So one of the things we need is, if we want to do this, is we've got to tackle things like climate change and change in a way that is fair to people. Now, how do we do that? What are some of the solutions on the table? Institutional investors in the US and in the EU and throughout the OECD, they should be required to adhere to standards of EESG reporting. They should have to indicate how they're factoring this in the stewardship requirements and to disclose that. It's not enough to require of companies that they do it. The people who act on them have to also be required to walk the walk. In the US, that means they should also be required in starting to shut down corporate political spending that acts on our society. And no corporation should get to pay to spend money without the approval of stockholders. And institutional investors should be shutting that down because no one gives their money for that purpose. In terms of standards around EESG reporting, the good news is that the Biden administration is going to be institutionally focused and is very internationally focused and respects international institutions. As Colin and others have mentioned, other regions of the world are doing well on these fronts. But for this to work, we need to bring together convergence. We can't have companies susceptible to being whipsawed by different standards. We need standards that are relatively uniform. As I say it in a kind of academic frame, a B- level set of consistent standards done for 5 years and moving towards A level is much better than the current cacophony. This is where the US through the Securities and Exchange Commission and the EU through its institutions need to come together and force convergence. And we particularly need to have change for convergence around measures doing to the workforce. And we ought to be talking about employees, workers, or other things, and we should stop degrading them by calling them human capital. That's another investor, very capitalist-driven term that's dehumanizing, and we ought to be focusing on convergence. And we ought to be focusing on convergence outside corporate governance around things like regionally appropriate living wages, safety conditions, the right to join a union, and reviving the things that made us all proud. In the current year in the US, I think a lot will hinge on what's going on in Georgia. The reason why it's so important is really the agenda setting process of the United States Senate. It's not so much the vote tallies, because there's the promise to frankly get some Republican votes on the floor if you can get bills put on the floor. For example, Florida and other red states have just passed living wage ballot initiatives. A living wage put on the floor of the US Senate is going to attract Republican votes. Even some labor law that's needed, reform is needed. Positive incentives for the B Corp. Senator Warren has proposed that all large corporations become basically a Delaware B Corp. The B Lab folks and I have worked on a model that would operate under state law, which is much more feasible. That's the sort of thing that could get support if you can get the floor. Requiring institutional investors to not just be allowed, not just allow them to take into account double ESG, but to actually require sorts of things, retirement funds, pension funds, others, is a very viable thing. Queuing off something from the UK that my friend Colin was involved in, I have proposed making the compensation committee of American large companies into a full-blown workforce committee to have to deal with fairness in terms of how you pay workers, in terms of how you pay your contracted workers, and in terms of things like racial equity, gender equity, and harassment and tolerance workplace, to have a committee of the board that has to do that and have that matched up with disclosure. Those are we have some viable opportunities here. A lot's going to turn on Georgia. If you don't have Georgia, unfortunately, we're at a point where you'd have regulatory action. And I want to say this, in the US, if you care about it, it's time for Congress to act. We need to update the ability of the Securities and Exchange Commission to protect our society against the power of private companies and to make them more accountable in terms of their disclosure around ESG. That requires legislative action. Stuff that needs to be done in labor law, living wage, requires legislative action. You can't do it all by regulatory action. And as I said, and I'll come back to this, unless you deal with corporate political power in the US, it is very difficult for things to work away. How does that affect the rest of you in the world? Well, for better or worse, we're a big player. And a lot of the things you're seeing in terms of institutional investor behavior, activism, has come your way from the US. The recent EU Commission report on corporations mentions trends in the EU that are very concerning around wage inequality and income inequality. Many of those are driven not by the corporations that we all focus on. They're driven by American-style institutional investor activism. And so we need to converge around common action and I will say, have a whole focus on these institutions in the middle. Because believe it or not, the people who run corporations have a lot more in common with their workers and their communities than the money managers. And for too long, we've let the money managers get scot-free. So if there's one thing I can say to you all is, let's make them walk their high-minded woke talk. And I appreciate you hanging in there with us, and I apologize for rambling on at the end, and I'll turn it back to our moderators.
Yeah, thank you very much, Leo. Jim, do we have time, since we've we've clearly gone over the hour and a half. Should we have a few questions from the audience? Because I saw
No, we
some
don't really have time because we
Okay.
need to be wrapping it up. But I think if you want to make some a closing comment, John, that would be welcome.
No, I want to thank all of the panelists for the very enlightening conversation this morning. I just want to touch on one theme that emerged from the chat, which was the urgency of some of the existential crises facing us, and the frustration of the glacial pace at which change happens within the law and the legislative process. So I want to acknowledge that there's some dynamic tension there. And the other theme that I wanted to acknowledge is that there's a sense that the benefit corporation may be just one stage of the evolution of the corporation to a more regenerative form. And I'll just close with one anecdote. I remember when we got the California benefit corporation legislation passed, we were feeling pretty happy with that achievement. And one of my friends from the regenerative community came to me and said, well, the benefit corporation is great because you've got to provide a material positive impact on society and the environment. But what about requiring a regenerative impact? What about requiring corporations to be part of a circular economy? So I think one of the themes that emerged from the chat is that the corporation will continue to evolve. And I think there's great hope over the next decade that we're going to see rapid change because the enormity of our existential problems is so great that it's going to put a very unusually high amount of pressure on politicians and policymakers to act quickly. So I think, we've seen a lot of change in the last decade, but I suspect over the next 10 years, we're going to see a lot more. So don't give up hope, because I sensed a little bit of cynicism and skepticism in some of the tenor of the chat. So stay tuned. More developments are coming.
Good. Well, thank you, John. And I think the cynicism is more concern that, as Shannon just put it in the chat, it's really come down to change or die.
Yeah.
Very simple. And that's just the reality. And, with greenwashing run amok and all the vicissitudes that are going on in the world today, it's very hard to stay patient with the glacial pace of change when the imperative to change is so obvious. But I really want to thank each and every one of you. This has been a very comprehensive discussion today. I celebrate the B Corp. We were one of the first B Corps in California that John was referring to in January 1, 2012. We filed by March of 2012 to be a benefit corporation. We're now a B Corp, proud to be such, and are involved, as been noted, in the transformation of the corporation as we endeavor at this critical hour, literally to save ourselves from ourselves so that human society can long endure. And that's the heart of this discussion. So John, this is your third session. Really want to thank you for the extraordinary brain power you have brought 3 consecutive times now. So Bill, Colin, Constanza, and Leo really appreciate your presentations today. And then tomorrow, we'll be having a session as we close out the year with a group of people, about a dozen people with whom we established Humanity Rising, to just look at the last 6 months or so, where we've got to, lessons learned, failures, successes, and begin to look toward 2021 and how we can continue to collaborate. So I hope people can join again, 5 p.m. Central European time. And now you'll see in the chat box the link to the after chat session. And everyone is invited to join and participate in a more informal atmosphere with some of the presenters. So thank you, everybody. We'll see you again tomorrow on Humanity Rising, 5 p.m. Central European time. Bye for now. And thanks again, John, and everyone.
Very welcome. Okay.
Yeah.